afternoon session covers some of the emerging research from the Beef Science Cluster, evaluating the true environmental footprint of beef cattle production Canada. Leading the discussion today is Dr. Tim McAllister from the Lethbridge Research Centre. He brings to us a wealth of knowledge from his lifetime of experience in the agriculture industry. Since 1997, he's been a research scientist in the rumen microbiology, feed nutrition, with a focus on microbiology nutrition and beef production and safety issues relating to livestock production. His research can be found in well over 1,000 documents, and he has been recognized internationally for his leadership and contributions to agriculture, research, and innovations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tim McAllister.
Thanks a lot, Mitchell. Well, I like to stand away from the podiums because when I get behind podiums, nobody can see who's speaking. So I want to thank Andrea for the invitation to come up and visit with you guys this afternoon. This is the furthest I've ever been in terms of the furthest north I've been in British Columbia. There's a lot of beautiful territory up here. I always make the point, like I'm down in Lethbridge, so that's Feedlot Alley, as you're probably all aware. But I always make the point when we take, and lots of tours come there and they want to see the big feedlots and everything. And I take them out and I show them those commercial feedlots. And I always make the point, you realize that there's 25,000 head of cattle in this feedlot, but out there somewhere, there's more than 25,000 head of cattle that produce the calves that are in this, in terms of the cow herd. So the cow herd doesn't get the same level of attention because of its dispersive nature, but obviously it's critical, and that's one of the points that we found in our research, is how critical the cow sector is to the overall beef industry in Canada, and we should never lose sight of that. So I run a fairly large research team with the federal government, and we work on, my whole career has been focusing on the one thing of every bit of research that I've got in common is that it has something to do with beef. And this work really stems from work that I really started quite a while ago, back in the late 1990s, which was looking at working with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that's the FAO organization out of Rome that set the criteria for how we count greenhouse gases globally. And I was one of the authors on the livestock chapter. So I contributed some to that. I did not, though, take responsibility for not counting the carbon in the soil in our grasslands as part of the carbon that you guys are contributing in terms of the sequestration that's taking place in all your grasslands. And that has not been recognized by the IPCC, and I think that that's a major shortcoming of that document. But basically, in 2007, that organization got the Nobel Peace Prize. Al Gore, if you remember, he was awarded that, and the IPCC got that prize. And I was recognized along with 200 or so other scientists as a contributor to that. The Nobel Peace Prize comes with $1 million, but we didn't see any of the money, so I want to make that clear as well. So I think, I'm sure most of you also have heard about the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. I think that that really speaks, like I travel internationally to the beef industry, basically globally. I've been in most every major beef producing nation in the world. And I think it really speaks highly to the initiative and foresight of the Canadian beef industry to start to take the consumers' concerns and how they're assessing what they eat and the value of what they eat, not only from a perspective of safety and quality, but also the production practices that are being used to produce it. And the fact that, McDonald's is a pretty big corporation, and they could have went anywhere in the world to basically start their testing for sustainable, what's the definition of sustainable beef production. And the fact that they came to Canada first really says something about the Canadian industry in my mind anyway. So part of this issue and where we're coming from this whole footprint stuff is that really, we all know about that we're really dealing in a global economy now. So what we do in northern BC or southern Alberta or anywhere is actually being viewed upon by the world consumers. And I thought I'd start by just giving you a perspective of where future markets are going to be and where future consumers are likely to arise, and some of the pressures that are affecting that as we move into 2050 and how that's going to affect the future of the industry. And I think for the most part, the future of the industry looks very bright as long as the global trends continue to go the way they are. And the first of those is related to the population. What's going to happen to the human population? Well, it's pretty clear based on the projections that we're going to reach at least 9.5 billion people by 2050, probably close to 10 billion by 2100. So the population is going to continue to increase. In most developed countries, we're actually at a negative balance in terms of population increase. But because of the demographics, that there's still more people that are going into the reproductive stage of life, even if we curtail the amount of overall growth, there's going to be enough people going that are still going to have babies and contribute to an increase in the population. Some of that may change, like for example, China just eliminated the one-child policy that they had. Now everybody can have two children. That's going to affect some of these demographics. It's likely, though, that they're probably pretty close in about 9.5 billion people. So we still have almost 2 billion people to add to the face of the earth by 2050. The other big change that's going on is we're seeing a mass migration from the rural communities into the urban centers. And that's going to continue. So there's more and more people that are less connected to the food that they're producing. And probably the best illustration of that is in China. You've probably heard about the ghost cities they talk about in China. I've been to China and into Inner Mongolia, and they're literally building cities, the size of Red Deer or about that size from scratch, and nobody lives in them. They're building the airports, the train stations, everything with the anticipation that that migration is going to continue. And it is taking place in China. So that trend where the urban population is going to have less and less connection with how their food produced is going to continue. The other is the distribution of the people on the globe. As it stands right now, we're about 7.5 billion people. So as we move towards 2050 and we reach 9.5 billion, we're going to have 1 billion people in North America, 1 billion people in South America, and 1 billion people in Europe. And those populations are going to stay relatively stable. We've got 2 billion people in Africa and 2 billion people in Asia. And we're going to add 1 billion more to each of these locations globally. So our growing markets in terms of expansion are going to be in Africa and in Asia and in India. So if we look more at that distribution of that population, you can see the trends. China is the most populous nation in the world right now. But by 2050, India is going to surpass them in terms of number of people. And then we have growth in Africa as well. In particular, within Nigeria, there's projected to be substantial populations increasing. So there isn't going to be really a significant population increase in North America or in Europe. So those markets are going to probably stay relatively constant and are not going to be areas of expansion in the future. So this just illustrates that a little bit more clearly based on food consumption data. And you can see that if you look at the increase in consumption, that increase is greater in the developing world than it is in the developed world. And in particular areas of sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia and East Asia is where those increases in consumption are going to take place. So those people are not only consuming more food, but they're also consuming higher quality food. And that's a good thing for our beef, especially our beef, because we produce some of the highest quality beef of any place in the world. Now, where's the hunger is, this is the FAO's hunger map. And really what it illustrates is that a lot of the places where there are famines today are associated with areas of disruption in government. So there's wars going on. There's other factors that are leading to inhibiting the ability of those regions to produce food or to import food into them in order to meet the demands of the people that they reside there. So places like Iraq, we've heard about Syria lately. It's quite clear that we could feed the world's people if we could just properly distribute the food and basically get rid of war. Because it's those, often you heard about in Syria how they're basically using famine as a form of warfare. They're restricting access through blockades and that in order to try to change people's behavior to get them to do what they want them to do. And in many countries of the world, we've made a lot of progress in terms of increasing the availability of food. But basically, the green areas look where we've had substantial improvements in the availability of food over time. Many of these nations are no longer at a hunger deficit because of the improvements in agriculture and the improvements in the government that have taken place to allow that agriculture to take place. But there's still areas that you can see that are in the red there, areas of problems like North Korea, where governments are really what's responsible for the lack of food. Now, if we look at the future, as I said, a lot of the developing nations, the richest nations of the world, those individuals are not going to consume a lot more food than they're already consuming. And then on the far end of the scale, the real poor people, they're always going to be sort of stuck and not have the funds in order to produce or to purchase the higher quality food either. Where the real growth is going to take place is in the middle class, where incomes are increasing, their appreciation for higher quality food is increasing along with that. And it's that demographic region of this area of income that are going to lead to increased caloric consumption, increased protein consumption. And that increased protein consumption translates into increased consumption of meat. So if you look at the demand then for food types, you can see that cereals are going to stay relatively constant in the developing world, but the consumption of both meat and milk is going to increase. And that's a very important protein source for many of those countries, especially, for example, like in India, where they have actually the largest dairy production in the world, even though their cows produce virtually less than 10 liters of milk per day. They've got so many cows that they're still the largest milk producers in the world. And that's a very important source of protein in India for meeting the needs of the overall population. So lots of times when you hear negative things about the beef industry, it's not with an appreciation for how important it is in terms of a protein source. And in most of those cases, one of the reasons why the milk production is so low is that they're basically being fed the waste products that are not being consumed by humans. So the quality of that feed is very low for the animal itself, so it produces a low amount of milk. But when you've got a lot of cows, you can still produce a lot of milk in terms of total liters that's produced within the country. So that's why when you look at the distribution of the overall production of beef, pigs, poultry, and sheep and goats, you can see that there's several countries that produce a lot more than what we do here in Canada. For example, Brazil is amongst the largest producer of beef in the world. India actually has more cattle, but you can see they don't produce as much in terms of overall production. So although Canada, comparatively speaking, has a small cow herd, we are one of the most important export nations in the world, about fifth in terms of exportation of beef. So ourselves, Brazil, United States, Australia are the big players in terms of beef export. So obviously we know how important the beef industry is to the Canadian economy. So this just illustrates then the total number of slaughtered animals. So comparatively speaking, the amount of cattle that are slaughtered, 296 million, is pretty small compared to the amount of chickens that are slaughtered. 58 billion per year are killed. And a lot of that is going in to meet the needs of China in terms of the consumption of poultry there. China has basically, in the case of poultry and swine, come to North America and basically copied the production systems here and taken them to China and replicated them in China exactly. In fact, there's a company in Saskatoon now that's building 80 swine to farrow barns throughout China in association with Cargill in terms of expanding the swine production within China as a whole. With the beef industry, they haven't been as calculated. So if you go to China, they suffer a lot from overgrazing in their beef industry. The beef industry is not integrated into production systems in terms of the feedlot system that we have in Canada. So the quality of the meat they produce, the length of time it takes to get that beef to a point where it's ready to slaughter are all substantially longer than what it is in the Canadian system. And that's one of the reasons why we have such a high efficiency. So if you look at the demand then for that beef, as I said earlier, this is beef here, that demand is going to increase in China and increase in Africa. There's some increase in South America and in Russia as well. Those are going to be the major areas where we're going to see an increase in demand for beef. And Russia is got big programs in place now trying to expand their industry. We had scientists come through wanting to learn how can we grow beef cattle in cold environments, and they're interested in that in Russia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians pretty well ate their entire cow herds. So they've been in a process of trying to rebuild, but there are logistical issues there and that with making that occur in an efficient manner. There is some Canadian technology that's going over to help out with that in Russia right now as well. So if we look at a per capita meat consumption, you can see that where the major increases, we've got Latin American, Caribbean going up about 19%, whereas if you look at Asia and Pacific, an increase of 24%, so almost doubling as well, more than doubling in Sub-Saharan Africa. So those are the areas of where that consumption is going to increase. So if we're going to make those increases, where are we going to produce that beef on a global basis? And one of the questions obviously is regarding to agricultural land. How much land is there available in the world to expand? And the answer to that is virtually none. There's been a lot of desertification occurring in Africa because of problems with water use and soil management issues, grazing issues have contributed to that. There's a lot of land globally that's been set aside for parks and urbanization and other properties that won't ever go back probably into agricultural land. So in reality, this little squiggly mark you see here basically represents the amount of land that's available for expansion in these various regions of the world. And it's very, very little that's actually available. So the only way we're going to be able to produce and meet that future demand is by being more efficient. We have to produce more food on the same or less amount of land is the only way we'll meet that demand. We can't do it by turning additional land. I've heard some of the stories, it seemed to me like some of the conversations I heard was that you guys are somewhat of a battle in these northern communities just keeping the bush back, that the bush is always trying to invade. So even keeping our existing agricultural land in production can be a challenge over time. So the focus of our investigation was on the carbon footprint, which is related to greenhouse gas emissions. And when we calculate those greenhouse gas emissions, we look at the emissions of carbon dioxide, which is primarily from the use of fossil fuels, the emissions of methane, which comes from the enteric fermentation within the animal itself, so the ruminant animal producing the methane, as well as some from the manure, and then the nitrous oxide. And the nitrous oxide comes from the nitrogen that's excreted by the animal. Most of that comes out as ammonia, or as urea, which is converted to ammonia. And then that ammonia can be deposited, especially when you're down where we are. It represents thousands of tons of nitrogen that are emitted from those feedlots and are deposited downwind. And in fact, if you're within a kilometer downwind of a feedlot, you don't have to ever worry about putting on nitrogen fertilizer because there'll be enough coming off of that feedlot to provide all your crop requirements. So those are the main greenhouse gases. And when you talk about the ruminant animal, the one that really puts the beef cattle sort of behind the eight ball is that production of methane. The enteric fermentation. Methane is a natural byproduct of the fermentation that takes place in the rumen. Pigs and chickens do not produce as much methane. They still produce nitrous oxide as a result of the manure they produce, but they don't produce as much methane. So that's why the emissions with ruminant animals are always higher than what you talk about the emissions with poultry or swine. So we've all known that the price of this is just projecting what's supposed to happen to the price of meat, and I think probably it's fairly accurate. We know the price of meat has gone up substantially even in the last couple of years. That trend will likely increase. Part of that is because the demand for meat is increasing. Globally, people are richer, as I showed in some of those graphs, than they ever have been before. And the more money that people typically have, the more they want to consume meat. And that's going to lead to growing demand and increasing prices. And probably because of the meat that's associated with the highest quality is beef, that demand is going to increase for beef, and probably the increase in the price will be greatest for that as well, as long as we continue to have global economic prosperity. And obviously one can imagine there's a few things that could probably throw a wrench into that. It's typically like we hear about China If it goes from 9% growth per year to 5% growth per year, we worried that there's a potential disaster taking place, whereas we're at a growth rate now of what, 0.1 or 0.2%. So it's a huge difference. China, you look at the amount of building and demand for resources that's there. If China were to drop to 0.2%, probably that global economic wealth trend would take a bit of a downfall. So there are some things that could influence this prediction, but if things keep going the way they have, these are what we project in terms of increased profit. So let's talk then about the Canadian industry and where it fits relative to other areas of beef production. There's about 68,000 farms or beef producers in Canada. Generates about $33 billion yearly for the Canadian economy. As I said, we're the 5th largest beef exporter in the world. We produced about 1.4 million tons of beef in 2014. And as I said, the world population continues, so will the demand for meat. So the European market, as I said, there is some opportunity there with what you've heard about the European free trade deal, but it's not going to be a huge opportunity. And they're still going to try to use things like the implants and the use of antibiotics and that in our production practices. Some of the things that lead to our higher efficiencies against us is a method of trying to restrict the amount of beef that we can export to those countries. China has a bit of a different opportunity there in that they do not have a well-developed beef industry, and it looks like it's going to be difficult for them to get one in place. That's where we could have a substantial opportunity for improved markets in the future. So along with that, we have to think of the broader environment that's associated with beef production. There's more than 50 million acres of pasture land in Canada. You guys manage vast tracts of grassland, which protect marginal lands from tillage and erosion. When I've been at the FAO in Rome, one of the points I raised at the last meeting when I was sitting around the table was I said, well, what about the impact of beef on biodiversity? And the FAO, that organization, that United Nations organization, is dominated by European people, European scientists. And they said, oh yeah, well, that chopping down the rainforest and all that, it's having a dramatic effect on biodiversity. And I said, well, that's not what I was thinking of. I was thinking about how beef contribute to the conservation of native grasslands in Canada, that our shortgrass prairie likely wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the beef industry because it would have been cultivated up. And I said, what about our species at risk, like the black-footed ferret, the burrowing owl, the swift fox, the sage grouse? All of these live in those environments, and those environments are partially protected because the beef industry is there and maintaining that habitat at the same time for beef production. So that wasn't their vision of the influence of beef production on biodiversity. The other important thing, as I already mentioned at the start of my talk, was the importance of how those grasslands sequester carbon. And there's a big debate now within the scientific community as to whether that sequestration continues to occur indefinitely. There's little debate that if you have grasslands that have not been properly managed and you manage them properly, that you will result in carbon sequestration taking place. There's even less debate whether that if you take a plow to those grasslands that you'll release huge amounts of carbon. That's for sure. In fact, we did another study where we looked at the production of a beef cycle, the Canadian beef cycle. We just used a 100-cow herd as an example. And we did projections about the amount of emissions that it takes to produce the beef from that 100-cow herd. And then we projected what would happen if we had cultivated land and we planted it all back into grassland in order to produce the forage, grass or perennial forage, to produce the forage that we needed to maintain that beef herd. And what it did is it turned the whole beef production system into a net sink for carbon. So it didn't matter about the amount of methane that was being emitted or the amount of nitrous oxide that was being emitted. The amount of carbon that was sequestered as a result of planting that cultivated cropland back to grassland more than made up for that. So the whole system became a net sink. So that just gives you an idea that when you cultivate up grassland, how much carbon is being emitted as a result of that practice. And of course, the protected habitat to promote biodiversity. And then the one thing that ruminants do better than any other is turning inedible plant material that we really can't make much value from in terms of consumption into high quality protein. And the Canadian industry will often be criticized because we use grain in our feedlots, and you'll hear them say, you know, and this is one thing that the Europeans will raise against us, or the Australians or the New Zealanders, because they use a lot more grass in their beef production systems, is they'll say, well, you guys are feeding a huge amount of grain there, and that grain should be going to feed people. But in reality, 80% of the feed that maintains the Canadian beef herd is still forage. It's not grain. Because of that vast amount of cow herd that's out there consuming the forage that you guys conserve for the winter and that. So, and when they're consuming the pasture land. So the Canadian industry is not founded in grain, it's founded in forage, because most of the feed that goes into the cattle herd is in the form of forage. So what are the challenges we're facing and the things that we have to be aware of in terms of where the consumers are going, and some of the things we're hearing more and more in the media? It all again goes back to the methane, and I always like when the media will use this picture a lot, and it immediately shows you a lack of their knowledge of the physiology of the animal, because the amount of methane that comes out of the back of the animal is about 2% of the total amount of methane they produce. So they actually should have this animal, the cow, more like a dragon, blowing the methane out the front end rather than the back end. And then you've seen the Meatless Mondays that have been pushing. I think we all need to be aware of these groups that are trying to gain momentum amongst the general public against the consumption of meat. Food Inc., there's been a bunch of documentaries. One of the ones just recently was called The Cowspiracy. Leonardo DiCaprio, the guy in The Revenant, the guy who made this film ran out of money, and DiCaprio stepped up and gave him the rest of the money to put the documentary together. So a lot of these guys don't understand the big picture, and I really took, you know, this one actually made me pretty mad, because in 2010 in Banff, we hosted what they call the global GGA, the Global Greenhouse Gases and Animal Agriculture Conference in Banff. So that's the largest scientific conference in the world on the amount of emissions that are produced from livestock production. It's actually this month in Australia, in Melbourne, that's going to be taking place, and I'm going to present the Canadian data at that meeting. But in this particular documentary, at that time there's a group called the World Watch, and a lot of these guys sort of disguise themselves as being scientists, but they've got a clear agenda in terms of what they're trying to promote. And that World Watch Institute released a document that really upset a lot of the people, even the people within the FAO and the other scientists that I were working with in Europe, that those numbers were clearly skewed and incorrect. So we wrote a rebuttal paper, that's what scientists do, so we wrote another rebuttal on a scientific basis, basically with the bottom line saying these guys are full of crap. That's what we said. And that was published and accepted by a scientific journal, so other peer-reviewed people read that and agreed with us. But when it came to it, these guys are sort of very protective. They're kind of like a lot of these groups that have a very strong agenda that they really don't necessarily need to follow science in order to try to promote. And they wrote another rebuttal back to us. So you get in this sort of situation where you are just arguing back and forth across the table. And often the media will pick that up and favor with the people that are arguing from the negative perspective. Anyway, this whole documentary is based on those guys' numbers, the ones that we said were full of crap. That's where all of those numbers come from. And they could have used, you know, it's a lot of other scientists will support the numbers that we use to make our calculations globally way more than what would report this. But this ends up in the documentary. So the New York Times, there's lots of press, and we actually had a pretty strong communication program for the data that I'm going to show you today, and we got coverage across the country. I don't know, there might have been more than 40 different media outlets between TV and newspaper and that picked up our scientific information, but I was disappointed still because we didn't get into the big ones. We didn't get picked up by the Globe and Mail. We didn't get picked up by the National Post. We didn't get picked up by the Toronto Star. Those big news organizations, you know, that really affect some of the major urban centers in Canada didn't really want to run a good news story. You can bet that if it would have been a bad news story, they'd have probably picked it up. So I'd still like to see us try to overcome that issue. We're hoping that the next time, if there is a bad news story released, we can counteract that by releasing some of our scientific data to try to straighten some of the stuff out. But a lot of it comes with public trust, and scientists still have a high level of public trust relative to a lot of other informational areas. And basically, when we started this study out, we didn't have a final conclusion. As a scientist, you don't have a final conclusion before you start. So we could have shown the Canadian industry was not very good, as well as we did show that it turned out that it looks pretty good. There's still issues that I'll talk about, but all in all, it was a good news story. And unfortunately, when you release a good news story, it's not picked up as much as a bad news story by the more general media. So the carbon footprint is a measure of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with human activities. It's called anthropomorphic emissions. So all human activity, that's the basis of the IPCC, is they try to calculate all the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with human activity. And of course, this is focusing on the beef cattle production. I already said what the major greenhouse gases are: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. The differences, though, between those is that carbon dioxide is given a value of 1, methane is given a value of 25, and nitrous oxide is given a value of about 275. So 1 nitrous oxide has 275 times the impact of 1 CO2. So that's why a lot of those numbers get a lot bigger, even though there's less methane produced compared to carbon dioxide, because methane is 25 times more contributing to the global warming effect. It's how come we see those larger numbers with those gases. So we did a comparison of the beef industry in 1981 to 2011 with regard to the amounts of greenhouse gases that are produced, the numbers of animals that were required to produce the beef, and the amount of land that's required to produce that amount of beef. And we picked those years because those were the major census years in 1981 and 2011. Obviously, we have to derive our data from somewhere, and we need historical records, especially for 1981, in order to do that. And so that's why we picked that 30-year time span. And we included a whole bunch of factors, which includes the types of feed. So the diets are a little different now than they were in 1981, so we looked at that. They also differ across the country. They don't feed the same kind of diets in Ontario as they do out west. So we looked at the feeding systems, comparing whether you're talking about backgrounding animals, finishing animals, stalker cattle that are going out onto grass, and then the beef herd as a whole, whether there's bale grazing going on, whether you're doing swath grazing. We looked at the cattle classes and numbers across that, their average daily gains and their carcass weights, and how those changed between 1981 and 2011. And then we estimated all the greenhouse gases. So you can see, although we're focusing on greenhouse gases, there's a whole bunch of parameters there that can also have an influence on your economic bottom line, like weaning weights, average daily gains, feed intake, feed efficiency. All of those things are considered in this model. So in summary then, what we found was to produce the same quantity of beef in Canada today as compared to 30 years ago. It takes 29% fewer cattle in terms of in the breeding herd. There's 27% fewer cattle are required. So every animal has a maintenance requirement. And that's the amount of energy. We have maintenance requirements. It's the amount of energy that we just require to maintain our body mass. It doesn't involve increasing our weight or increasing producing milk or having any products produced. Our bodies are continuously turning over. So the liver is pretty interesting. The liver is synthesized about 200% every day. That's how much protein goes through our livers. The liver, that's why it's such a resilient organ. You can actually cut a piece of the liver out and it'll grow back. So all of that maintenance requirement requires energy. If we have fewer cows producing the same amount of beef, then the amount of maintenance that we have is lower because we have less maintenance with fewer numbers of cows. So that beef was produced on 24% less land between 1981 and 2011. And it resulted in a greenhouse gas footprint that was 15% smaller than it was in 1981. Of those gases that were produced, methane accounted for about 3/4 or 75% of the total gases. So as I said earlier, methane is always a big contributor to beef cattle production. Over 78% of those emissions came from the cow-calf sector. And that's because we feed those forage diets, and the forage diets are associated with emissions of higher levels of methane. And obviously that's a major area for mitigation, and that's actually a major area for mitigation globally in beef cattle production. Unfortunately, it's also the most difficult sector to come up with mitigation strategies for. One of the most promising one is probably an improvement in forage quality. Higher quality forages produce less methane per kilogram of feed consumed. So that's an example of an area within the beef cow herd where those improvements can be made. Part of the reason for that is because most of the additives that are designed for lowering methane emissions now that are showing promising have to be administered to the animal every day. And in the cow herd, which are often on extensive production systems, it's not realistic to administer something to an animal every single day in a uniform manner. And that's why it's a big challenge. The most promising technology now that research is being done for mitigating emissions in the cow herd is the development of a vaccine against the methanogens, the bacteria in the rumen that produce the methane. And New Zealand is doing work on that now. They've invested millions on trying to come up with a vaccine like that. They're making progress, but they're not quite there yet. Where else did those improvements come from? Well, some of them are related to improvements in reproductive efficiency. So more cows are getting pregnant. Increases in weaning weight, about a 20% improvement there. And a big increase in slaughter weight, up 29% for steers and over 45% for heifers. So that increase in slaughter weight has been a big factor that's resulted in our improvements in efficiency. And it's quite interesting, like I was just in Argentina about a month ago, and I was down there and I was looking in their pens of cattle, and they said, well, these are about ready to go to slaughter. And they looked like they weighed maybe 700-800 pounds. And I said, well, those would be just backgrounders where we're from. You're like, those would be still 100 days away from slaughter weight. And he said, well, and the genetics in the animals are just completely different. I was really surprised. And they said that the reason for that is because Argentina, as you notice, didn't export a lot of beef. Part of that was due to their government and their economic situation, and that they weren't big into promoting exports of their agricultural products. But the other part was related to the population in Argentina as a whole relating high quality beef to small carcass sized animals. And they thought that if an animal gets bigger carcass, then it's got to be older, therefore it's got to have low quality beef. And so that's why they're killing those cattle at such light weights, and their genetics are promoted towards having those cattle. Those cattle have been in the feedlot as long as ours would be when they're finished. Is that kind of selection pressure. And it really was dramatic to see the difference between their system and our system, where we're producing cattle of a much higher carcass weight in a shorter period of time. And that's really what's leading to our increased efficiencies. And the scientists in Argentina realized that, and they're hoping they just had a change in government. They're hoping to change their production system as a result. But you get that mindset within the consumer and within the producer, it's very difficult to change those patterns of behavior. The other areas in improvements of the feed that we have available, and a lot of that is related to increased yields of barley grains. So they've gone up 23%. Barley silage has gone up. Corn has gone up a huge amount. Corn grain is not as important for Western Canada, but it has a role in Eastern Canada. And then we've had corn silage, and we've had a huge increase in the use of corn silage in southern Alberta. I can tell you a story that I experienced from the Dakotas. So in southern Alberta there, I mentioned how we always have these people come up for tours of the feedlots. And we used to have South and North Dakota producers come up, and they would want to visit with us as to how we feed those high barley grain diets, because in the United States, barley is known as a real hot feed, and that you could only probably really use corn effectively. Barley is just too hot of a feed to finishing animals, especially when you're talking about 85 to 90% grain in the diet. And these producers would come up out of South and North Dakota and want to visit with us. Well, how do you process the grain? How do you adapt the animal to those high grain diets? And the idea was that they wanted to develop a feedlot industry in the Dakotas that was barley based. Well, that was about 15 years ago they were coming up, and they've never been back since. And last year I took a trip down into the Dakotas, and I understood why they haven't been back, because there was no barley there. It was all corn. Everything had been planted to corn. And we're seeing that migration of corn north, and companies like Monsanto and Pioneer are investing millions in developing low heat unit varieties with the idea that they'll move north. They want to see corn growing on the Northwest Territories border is their end objective. That'll take years, but we keep seeing increases in yield with corn, and it's still not showing any signs. One would think that biologically there's a limitation to how far it can go up, but that yield increase has pretty much increased consistently over the last 50 years. So where are we going from here? Well, I'm quite interested in the presentations that we're going to have this afternoon. I think I'll probably learn a lot, because some of these presentations are aligned with where we want to go with the project in the next steps. So some of those are looking at water use. I see the same sort of things in water use estimates that I've seen in the greenhouse gas, in terms of exaggerations that just are not anchored at all in science. Some of those figures are based on a cow being in a section of land. A thunderstorm comes through, it rains a bunch, and they equate all the water to the cow that happens to be in that section of land in terms of the amount of meat that's to be produced. We're interested in air quality. One of the gases we didn't talk about is ammonia. Ammonia contributes to a reduction in quality, a big issue in the feedlots as well. And then the biodiversity. We have a biodiversity team that we've set up with the University of Alberta that are also going to be looking at that aspect. So Canadian beef producers have not only improved production efficiency, but also significantly reduced their carbon footprint. The cow-calf system accounted for most of the methane, and is obviously a site of where we need to focus in terms of mitigation. Finding a balance between production efficiency, the benefits of grazing, and reducing the carbon footprint is where we're going in the future. So as I mentioned, improving the quality of forages could be one way of lowering methane. Selecting the animals for improved production and reproduction. You know, a lot of the stuff that we've done in health all relate to the improvements in the efficiency that we've seen. So I think we have a good news story. I'd encourage you guys to tell your story to everybody that you encounter, to try to counteract some of the negativity that isn't anchored in science like this particular project is. I just want to acknowledge, like, I'm just one guy in a big team. University of Manitoba was intricately involved in this. Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, CanFax, Environment Canada even had a role in the estimates that we came up with from the study. So we want to produce, we got to remain that sustainability also means being profitable. So we can't ask producers to undertake practices that are going to drive them out of business. That's not sustainable. We need to think about efficiency, and there's always room for improvement in that, and I think that it'll continue. We need to make sure that the food is safe, which we have major systems in place, nutrition, equitable, and then not be afraid to talk about how we are also involved in green production. So I just want to thank the team I have back in the Research Center as well. Thanks a lot. I'd be happy to address any questions if I haven't talked too long. Okay.